So good morning, everyone. It's good to see you. It's like seeing a lot of old friends. Um, Last week and this week, the theme has been death, mainly in the context of the sangha. But other than Dave, I have not really experienced that context as some of you have, especially up in Portland. So I'm going to talk about some of my own thinking about death and teachings in the context of teachings of Anatta and conditionality. And it's easy to get abstract and less real about death. So with that in mind, and thinking about my own death, I realized that, like my life, I tend to create a story about it. In other words, a kind of self around death. And that's okay as long as it does not get out of hand. And my job as meditator is not to get rid of the self, but to become more aware of the personal stories I have and perhaps to lessen their hold on me. Of course, there is also the fear of dying, but I'm going to put that aside for the moment. So the question I have is, how personal is death? You know, of course it's our own leaving, but then the story ends. In a way, it seems that death is really a social event. It's the leave-taking for all of us who are left behind. It's the severing of ties and connections and relationships that we have with the person who has died. My uncle, on my dad's side, died several years ago. And I remember having conversations with him about all the old friends he had from college and med school. How over the years they had kept in touch. And when I think of my uncle's death, I think not so much of his passing, but of how all those lifelong connections were broken, how that particular web of relationships suddenly stopped. Another uncle, my Mexican uncle, Alex, also died several years ago. He was the head of a large family of sons and daughters, grandchildren and great-grandchildren. His death meant a great loss for the family. It meant rearranging how the family viewed themselves. Would there be someone to take Alex's place as the head of the family? They processed his death in the traditional Catholic rituals of masses and rosaries and family gatherings. I think back to my experience of my parents' death, many more than 30 years ago. My father was a college professor with many interests and many friends, but he was kind of obsessed with controlling aspects of his life. And when he was diagnosed with prostate cancer that had metastasized, he tried many kinds of therapy, including things that were not allowed in the U.S. But in the end, unable to control this final part of his life, he was not ready to go and was angry and bitter at the end. And it was difficult to witness. My mother, on the other hand, died a quiet death, but she had already suffered a kind of half-death several years earlier when she had suffered a massive stroke. She held on for 2 years, but was scarcely with us except for a few lucid moments. And the family's experience of her death was more relief than sorrow. The question was, when did she actually leave us? My mom and dad were both good people, doing the best they could in the conditions they lived in. And I relate these stories because how they shape my views and about how I want to go. These are ideals I have about dying, and I have learned that ideals can create unnecessary stress and difficulties. Well, I want to die quietly and calmly with all of my faculties in place. I want those around me to feel comfortable and reassured that I'm okay. But I realize that I have no control over that. I'm making a story about my death that may or may not be real. Just as my dad was unable to control the cancer that finally took him, I won't be able to control the conditions and circumstances of my own death. I am reminded of an old Zen story I heard once. A revered master was dying, and his students were gathered around him. The master was upset and crying, and the students, surprised at this display of suffering by their teacher, asked him, "Master, what is wrong? Why are you crying?" And he replied, "I don't want to leave. I don't want to leave you. I'm not ready to go." He was being real. His students were looking on with an idealization as to how a master should behave, even at death. In a way, the story I create about my own death is a continuation of the story I have about my own life. And that story doesn't seem complete. There always seems to be a feeling that something is unfinished. Whatever I thought how my life would be at the end, a sense of completion, of being done with the business of living, that may not be the way I feel. What is the secret to feeling complete? Okay, I'm ready to go. Emily Dickinson, I'm going to read a couple of lines from her famous poem, but I'm leaving out a couple of the rhyming lines. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves. We slowly drove. He knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too. Thank you for listening. We will now take some time for meditation. I'll ring the bells, and then we'll have time for reflection and time to come back together at the end.